Welcome to episode 5 of We Evolve. We will continue our conversation with maladaptive daydreaming, now with an expert and pioneer himself, Dr. Eli Somer.
He is a founder and senior researcher at the International Consortium for Maladaptive Daydreaming Research, ICMDR, a clinical director, established the ISMD, the International Society for Maladaptive Daydreaming, pioneered research on maladaptive daydreaming, is a professor in psychology, former president of the European Society for Trauma and Dissociation. I'm essentially reading out his entire LinkedIn, folks. And he has an Instagram page and a YouTube channel called Somer Clinic with a lot of great videos regarding this topic if you're ever interested and more curious about this. So you guys should definitely check that out. Dr. Somer.
Thank you for having me. So there wasn't a question, was there?
Yeah, so we're just giving you an introduction if you wanted to add anything onto that. No?
That's plenty. I'm a clinical psychologist and a researcher, so that summarizes it.
All right. Well,
Okay, then we're gonna go ahead and just it's not an interview, so don't feel like it has to be through a form or anything like that. We're just gonna ask a couple questions because we're students and we would like to know more about maladaptive daydreaming.
Sure.
But in your words, what is maladaptive daydreaming and what insights have you found when performing research?
Well, dreaming is, of course, a mental activity that most of us share, but there is a confusion of terms. Uh, Most people refer to daydreaming when they actually uh, talk about mind wandering. So mind wandering is our chain of associations and thoughts that is typical when we are off task. When we're not focusing on some kind of a cognitive or physical task. So our mind wanders from one thought to the other. Usually, mind wandering is about things that these are brief episodes of thinking about discussion we've had with a friend, rehearsing presentation we need to make soon, or preparing what to cook for dinner. So the mind goes from one thought to the other, very brief, uh, focusing on these different ideas. It's usually not very creative, not very, and not emotionally not very engaging. So that's mind wandering. When people do that, they seem like zoned out, and we call it daydreaming. But actually, daydreaming involves a much more, say, complex mental activity that is usually around a theme, a scenario. So when somebody is not just rehearsing a conversation they have had with a friend or with a boss, but actually going into detail and elaborating on it and imagining the responses and sort of developing a plot around it, then it really becomes more like a daydream. When we talk about maladaptive daydreaming, the term maladaptive uh, signifies something is wrong, something is not quite adaptive. When I coined this term, something around 2000, 2002, I was reluctant to call it a disorder because it was sort of the first time the idea was presented that daydreaming could be disordered, could be problematic. But this mental activity is based on a trait, an ability to fantasize very vividly. So that trait in itself, of course, is not pathological. It's I would call it a talent that some people are endowed with. The ability to immerse oneself, to absorb oneself in very elaborate, fanciful, imaginative, fantastical storylines that, could involve anything spanning from idealized situations, idealized family life, an idealized relationship, or an idealized self, to fantastical sci-fi worlds or Harry Potter style worlds.
Mhm.
And these stories can evolve over time, like not unlike a soap opera or a series of, so people can come back to it and continue. It's people who have this ability to come back and continue the storyline. And many of them report a powerful sense of immersion
Mhm.
and presence in the fantasy. Uh, so these kind of fantasies can evoke emotions and other senses. So people can smell or sense of certainly color or hear things that are being said. They're not hallucinating because they are in charge, they're in control, and they can differentiate
Right.
between
Mhm.
between fantasy and reality, and that this is a fruit of their imagination. So far, so good. So we're talking about an ability that could be a lot of fun, but here lies the problem. If something is freely available to alter your consciousness and it's legal,
Yes.
then it can become addictive. And
Yeah.
Okay.
when it becomes addictive, I call it maladaptive. So maladaptive daydreaming here is a very long answer to your short question. Maladaptive daydreaming is immersive dreaming to a point where it involves hours every day, creating distress and dysfunction.
Yes. So,
Wow.
in another interview that I watched, you had a recent one with Dr. Hassan, and you mentioned your work in hypnosis and how it would help self-regulate. So, what makes hypnosis helpful and maladaptive daydreaming harmful? You just went into how it can be addictive. And I actually have another question of how that addictive cycle works, but how is that differentiating from hypnosis and that particularly is helpful? Because you also have somebody else that's in control.
Yeah, yeah. Well, immersive daydreaming has, to my mind, self-hypnotic features and characteristics. Uh, People induce it, sometimes with meditative movement, often with music. So it's very much like a self-hypnosis. It involves heightened state of concentration. Um, so there are similarities there. Uh, but how is it different? It's different in the sense that people who do it, unlike hypnosis that is done by another person, they don't lose control, they don't give up control. They are in charge of scripting and directing and sometimes acting uh, their screenplay. So this is how, but there is a connection there. I agree with you with self-hypnosis. What was the other part of your question?
So next, I wanted to go into how there's a cycle with maladaptive daydreaming. So I remember you once mentioned that you feel guilty for not getting any work done, and then to soothe yourself, you then go back into the daydreaming. So how can this be seen in cases? How can this be put in a real world scenario?
It potentially can create an addiction because maladaptive daydreaming does two things. First, it has uh, the ability, it can remove someone from a distressful environment, a distressful experience, or a distressful emotional state by creating an alternate reality that is much more pleasant. So it is reinforcing, it is rewarding, it can be rewarding by removing a negative and aversive state of mind. But it is also rewarding because it can induce pleasant feelings by imagining highly desirable situations that are enjoyable or meaningful emotionally. So these are two kinds of reinforcement. Negative reinforcement by withdrawing uh, oneself from a pleasant situation or feeling, and a positive reinforcement by creating rewarding, gratifying internal experiences. So that is an addictive uh, process in itself. Now, what you described is something that I talking about is the sense that when people do it excessively, and everything, this is a good thing when it is exercised in moderation, but when people uh, engage in this form of fantasy and live in fantasy rather than in reality, it can come at the expense of one's obligations, such as schoolwork, family life, social obligations, uh, requirements one needs to meet at work and so on. It comes at when it comes at the expense of it, and performance is compromised. Then, when they wake up from this very enjoyable trip, I would call it, uh, they wake up to the reality that they haven't actually accomplished much in real life and that they're behind. That often creates distress. And how do you soothe yourself when you're distressed? You go to whatever means or activities that you are familiar with and you know that makes you feel good. In this case, many people with maladaptive daydreaming compensate for feeling bad about wasting their life away in fantasy by fantasizing more.
Mhm. So that makes sense.
That's a trap. Yeah.
Yeah. But like hypothetically, if somebody were to get out of that cycle and they let go of a dream. So I spoke to some friends of mine, some family members, and they all self-reportedly have maladaptive daydreaming or they think that they might be experiencing that. And so they have different stories and eventually like they let go of one and in the process of creating another. So when they let go of them, I notice that they have a drop in their face. They begin to feel saddened. So it leads me to the question, does someone who lets go of a dream experience grief?
Well, it's I don't know if you're familiar with the phenomena of the imaginary friend. Young children have it, and it's considered normal. Uh, so people can develop attachment, to this imaginary friend. And people and older individuals can develop attachments to the environments that they create because it's safe, it's under their control, and it is associated with relaxation or positive feelings. So obviously, when you give that up, um, experience a sense of loss. Uh, the You're talking now about attempts, I guess, to curb this habit, to curb this mental activity. And this is exactly the challenge. I'm not expecting people who are struggling with maladaptive daydreaming to give up this mental activity. Okay, it's impossible because it's just a normal brain activity. It's a normal phenomenon.
You
It's
compared it
like
to eating disorders before in another interview. I'm like, you can't really stop it because you have to keep eating. And so you can't stop this
true,
because you have to keep using your mind activity.
true, true. And there are also benefits to immersive daydreaming when it's not pathological, it's not excessive. There are benefits to it that we can discuss later. So uh, I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The idea is, the challenge is to control it. So, so many people who I'm working with find ways to remind themselves during their productive hours to stay engaged. There are techniques and different techniques to do that. And they learn to allocate specific amounts of time uh, that would not cause them distress and would not be at the expense of obligations in which they can daydream. For example, when you wash your dishes, this is an automatic behavior that doesn't require a lot of focusing and mental effort. This is a good time to daydream, to fantasize if you choose to do that.
Yeah, as a
And
pastime.
here is another example that might be familiar to you, the highway hypnosis, they call it. It's when you drive from one uh, location to a different destination, and it's a familiar route that you're taking. The the driving becomes automatic. So part of your mind is navigating, negotiate, the other cars with the other cars, and you watch the traffic signs. But when you reach your destination, sometimes you don't remember having passed through all these landmarks because you were doing something else in your mind. You were
Mm.
daydreaming.
Yeah.
So this is a normal example of how the mind can split, the consciousness can split, and it's not at the expense of doing anything productive because the mind can do an automatic set of behaviors without requiring a lot of mental resources.
It's
So
interesting.
in summary, the challenge is for individuals just to learn to control it.
Yeah.
So it becomes just so they can enjoy the immersive daydreaming and it doesn't become.
Yeah. So it doesn't become pathological.
So to kind of go back to what you and Alina were talking about with kind of comparing maladaptive daydreaming to other mental health illnesses, we see that there's a increase in risk or enhancement of maladaptive daydreaming from other mental health conditions like ADHD or OCD or even dissociative disorders. Why do you think that is?
Because you also mentioned like there could be a trait for this. So is there a correlation between this? And I also have another follow-up question for that, but let's start with
Wait, wait,
this.
wait.
Yeah, before I hit you with everything, we said this wouldn't be
Mental,
an interview type, but it really feels like it right now.
right. Well, many people still unaware of this condition. It's been coined just the term in 2002. Since then, we have many studies, good research. Uh, and one of the uh, skeptical arguments is that you're just pathologizing a normal, just making the DSM bigger and bigger. It doesn't make any sense. Well, we have shown that this is not the case because an adaptive daydreaming is significantly associated with other mental conditions, with other mental disorders. So if it would have been a normal mental activity, we wouldn't see these statistically significant correlations with depression, with anxiety, uh, with obsessive compulsive disorder, and with ADHD. Now, in terms of causality or directionality, what causes what, we don't know exactly. Uh, but let me tell you that many other mental conditions that are listed in the DSM are also correlated with other unrelated and distinct disorders. So mental disorders usually come in clusters and have a relationship between them. Um, so it would make sense that if immersive daydreaming has this powerful capacity for self-soothing, that it would serve well a lot of individuals who suffer from emotional pain. And these would be people with depression and with anxiety who happen to discover that they have this innate capacity to make them feel better,
Mm.
and they use it as self-medication. In the case of ADHD, for example, I think you mentioned this condition, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder.
Mhm.
We found an extremely high comorbidity of maladaptive daydreaming with ADHD, but not the hyperactive type, the inattentive type.
Okay.
And But when we tested people with ADHD for maladaptive daydreaming, let me reverse it. Let me go back a little bit. When we test individuals with maladaptive daydreaming, we had something like a 77% comorbidity with ADHD. It's enormously high, which makes you think, well, wait a minute, are these, maybe it's the same thing. So we go to a group of people diagnosed with ADHD, and we found that only 20% of them have adaptive daydreaming. So it's not the same.
Mhm.
So what is probably happening here is that people with maladaptive daydreaming are simply habituated to focus their attention inwardly, and that is at the expense of paying attention to the external world, to the external reality, hence the inattention.
Mhm.
So it's a probably a subtype. There's a subtype, a maladaptive subtype of ADHD, the inattentive type. So that's again a long answer to your question. Yes, there are relationships between maladaptive daydreaming and other mental disorders. We are not always sure about the directionality, but I talked about self-medication as one possible to this connection.
I guess like this is a way to compensate, I suppose, when there's a lot of uncontrollable factors or things that move constantly, you have one thing that is controllable and steady, and that's something that's inward, as you discussed. Um, and to go on to what you mentioned previously on how this could be a trait, a talent. And in another interview, you also mentioned that this can be genetically predisposed. So, can this be due to generational trauma, or how does that affect those, for example, that go through genocides or wars? Because that trauma can then go through and be passed down to different generations. So does that have an effect?
You're ahead of what we know in terms of scientific evidence. These are excellent questions, but we don't know how is this passed down. But we notice. I mean, I get a lot of individuals who are struggling with daydreaming. Sometimes I recruit them to my qualitative studies and I interview them. Sometimes I just correspond with them. And what I learned from many people is that they, not all, but some just volunteer the information that sister has it, father seems to be pacing back and forth and talking to himself, seems to be in a different world occasionally. So I have the impression that this may have a genetic component. What we are absolutely sure about is that unlike conditions like depression or schizophrenia, it doesn't pop out, it doesn't emerge, it can emerge all of a sudden in adulthood. So most people who we talk with tell us that they have been daydreaming immersively, intensely since childhood, that they have known that they had this ability for a long time. And remember themselves rocking in, on the rocking chair on their porch for hours and exercising and so on and so forth. But some people, of course, activate this capacity for self-soothing only when they encounter adversities. But we have evidence that it is innate. And if it is innate, then it is very probable that there could be family clustering, that this phenomenon occurs more in among family members. But it hasn't been studied yet. So, for you majors in psychology, I challenge you to such research study.
Right. Interesting. So we do have another question, but how did you first identify maladaptive daydreaming as a distinct phenomenon?
Well, I am a trauma clinician and researcher. Most of my career has been dedicated to the treatment and study of survivors of child atrocities. And my clinic obviously is comprised of individuals with history of childhood trauma. So it was in this context, which is of course a very biased sample, but that was my clinical world in this context that at a certain point at the beginning of the millennium, uh, I noticed that a cohort of patients, there were six,
Mhm.
so it caught my attention. Six of my patients alluded somewhat bashfully to very rich fantasy activity that they often engage in. So it caught my attention. I interviewed them in depth about it, and I described it in that seminal paper, the 2002 paper, which I coined the term. I made an error then. It wasn't a gross error, but it was based on the sample that I assumed it was a post-traumatic, but it was a wrong assumption because my sample was very biased.
Yes.
They
Okay.
all had that trauma history.
Right.
So we know today that there is a correlation between the maladaptive daydreaming and traumatic history, but many people with this condition have do not report childhood. So this is a trait that is very rewarding, as I explained earlier, and can become
Mhm.
addictive. But of course, if you encounter as a child overwhelming pain, and which is inescapable because you cannot go anywhere, you're too young to understand how to protect yourself. What you're left with sometimes is the option to escape in your mind.
Mm.
So that's a wonderful coping mechanism for children. It saves them.
Mm.
Overarching mechanism, we call it dissociation. So some children can imagine that it doesn't, that they don't feel the pain in their body. So we call it depersonalization, the realization that the reality is not real, that the one who abuses them is not their father, but someone else. And these are all mental tricks that children can employ. We call it dissociative mechanisms. Or they can make what they experience and know inaccessible to the mind, and we call it amnesia, not remembering. But there is another way that we've discovered now that some children can pretend that they have an alternate world that they can go to. And some of them imagine that they have an idealized family that loves them and protects,
Yeah.
that they have imaginary friends that soothe them and play with them, which is wonderful, of course, as a defense mechanism.
Yeah.
When they get stuck in it, when the abuse is over and they just cannot give up the habit, it becomes a way of living, then it can.
So I kind of have a question kind of going along with what you said. So earlier you mentioned that a lot of people they don't voluntarily come and say that they're going through maladaptive daydreaming, right? So we did a podcast right before this podcast, and it was just the three of us talking about maladaptive daydreaming, like the statistics and the facts and stuff. So I have a question because me and Shivani, we talked about how sometimes we kind of dream about things, like daydream, I guess, like our mind kind of wanders away. So do you think that people can go through maladaptive daydreaming and not even know that they're going through it?
Yeah, the this condition didn't even have a name before we coined the term and started studying it. And most mental health clinicians never heard of it, let alone pe people at large, the public at large. So people may think that either it's normal and everyone does that, or that the only person in the world who has this condition. Uh, and they, and what happens now is because we are in the age of internet and information highway, people Google their symptoms and and immediately they come across the term. So yeah, many people had it, and the condition was not born when I coined the term. It exists, of course. So and the reactions that I get is people get a sense of relief that they're not these weirdos, that it's something that has a name and has an explanation to it, and it can be treated, which is good news.
Speaking of which, in another interview, you mentioned like mindfulness thinking or mindful therapy. And so that's like a form of treatment. Can you elaborate on what that is?
Yeah. Well, my uh, my lab has produced what is currently the only randomized controlled trial for treating maladaptive daydreaming. And what we did is assign people randomly to two kinds of online to manualized treatment. We don't even intervene personally. They had to go through different modules and learn certain skills. To make a long story short, main components of the intervention, which was aimed at reducing spending, not in curing it or completely. So, so what we did, we uh, started to explore the online chatter of people with maladaptive daydreaming, of people who have this Reddit, Facebook, and learn from that, learn from the experts by experience that when their mind is engaged with some kind of a task that demands their attention, for example, the simplest thing would be to talking to someone.
Yeah.
You cannot talk to someone and daydream at the same time because these are you gotta direct your attention resources either externally or internally.
Mhm.
So we're describing different conditions and situations in which they were less likely to daydream. And we assumed from that it would be interesting to test how teaching people to be mindful about their external environment affect their daydreaming because these are incompatible mental activities. So by mindfulness, actually, what people do is they are trying to be present not to think about the past, not to be judgmental about what's going on in their mind, not to worry about the future, but to pay attention to colors, the sun, sensation in their body, and the flow of thoughts in their mind, their breathing, the different techniques to it. And we encourage people to do several things. First, we started with motivation. Because it's an addiction, you gotta have a very strong motivation to overcome, to give up this rewarding activity. So we worked with the people to sort of help them formulate some self-affirming statements of what do they stand to gain from coping strategies. And then we introduced self-monitoring. So people just need to be accountable for how much time they spend in fantasy. And often this intervention in itself, just paying attention and monitoring this behavior creates a reduction, even though we just wanted to monitor it, because people become accountable. They don't want to, okay, they need to make a decision. Do it now or not. So motivation enhancement, self-monitoring, and, uh, and mindfulness training. We encourage them to practice this daily, several times a day. And yes, and we found that and these were only 8 sessions, 8 online sessions of teaching modules that people had to go through and report what they have learned, activity. And after only 8 sessions, about 35% reported significant improvements. So, and it was statistically significant. So this showed that if there is a way to help people gain better control over the daydream. But this is very behavioral. This is, of course, a technique that helps people uh, control the urge, control the urge to employ this form of self-medication. But what about the underlying pain?
Yeah.
That's a different story, and that requires a different kind of therapy. So treatment should be two pronged.
Hmm.
We need to provide people with tools to control this form of self-medication, but also to
And the underlying
reduce the
problem.
internal pain
Yeah.
that that and help them meet their feelings and their emotions, and whatever they don't want to look at uh, for that. So that takes much longer than 8 sessions.
Right. And then speaking of those eight sessions, were they in person or online? Was that even an option?
They never met us. These are so you can imagine if this were a face-to-face meeting
Yeah.
that have tailored the intervention individually to people, it would have been much more effective. This was a research study in which we treated in that way hundreds of people
Mhm.
simultaneously.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
so that's helpful.
so it just, but I agree with you, or you didn't say that, but maybe I will say it very clearly that we need more follow-up studies to to test different protocols.
Yeah.
But that modest study, which was scientifically quite rigorous, but in terms of the intervention, shows that there is help, that it can be treated.
So, in one of your research papers, you mentioned like there was an increase in MD cases seen due to the isolation of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, going along that mindfulness training in those modules, is there a way to reach a mass of people that might be experiencing this in isolation to cope using those modules in the mindfulness training?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, this treatment module is still online somewhere, and
Mm.
we haven't used it again, but we could make it available if we decide. I mean, we keep it inaccessible to others because we want it again in research.
Yeah.
But theoretically, you could open this up when we have no financial commercial interest of it. We don't want to get, so we will eventually open it up to the public, so anyone could access these training videos and benefit from this. Some people, however, need the face-to-face interaction with us, because it's very difficult, when you have the tendency to drift away into fantasy, to to recruit enough self-discipline to go through these online videos, because you remember we talked about the attention deficits, many of them.
Right. Yeah.
So So I presume that this could be helpful to many, but not all. And face-to-face interventions would be much more effective for many individuals. But here we run into another problem. Most therapists don't ever heard about maladaptive daydreaming. It's that our biggest challenge
Mhm.
at this point is to get it into one of the major psychiatric manual like the DSM.
Yeah. So you think that it should be in the DSM?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We not just because it's my baby, it's because that's what the data say.
Right.
The science says that it's a distinct disorder that can be reliably measured across many cultures, and that it is not better explained by any other existing psychiatric conditions. So, and recently we have written a position paper
Mhm.
which was accepted for publication in a very prestigious psychiatric journal, signed by all the leading experts in the field of dissociation, stating that maladaptive daydreaming should be included in the DSM under the chapter of dissociative disorders. So that's a political move, but we also have the evidence to support it, and we presented some of the evidence in the position paper.
Okay. So before you mentioned like there could be potential benefits and you said like potentially like coping mechanisms and something of that nature. So did you have a question?
I did, yes. Can maladaptive daydreaming be beneficial in any way, such as fostering creativity or problem solving?
Uh, there is a contradiction in terms. Could a disorder be beneficial? Could a mental disorder be beneficial? So if it's maladaptive, then by definition, it's not good. It creates distress
Mhm.
or some kind of impairment of functioning. But I assume that you may you probably refer to immersive dating. Immer so immersive. So it's all a matter of a continuum. It's a matter of degree.
Mhm.
Um, I'm a wine connoisseur. I love wine. It's a very complex drink, and I'm curious about the different regions of wine and different varieties of grapes and so on. But it's alcohol.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So savoring a nice glass of wine over dinner or a wine tasting event is great. But downing a bottle of wine one
Yeah.
sitting, and that's
Moderation.
every day,
Right.
that's not cool.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, so like this, going forward with this analogy,
Mhm.
uh, immersive daydream is a fantastical trait, which I don't have, unfortunately. I wish I would have had it because
Careful what you wish for.
it sorry.
I said be careful what you wish for.
No, it's too late. I said it's innate.
Mhm.
I'm already 73 years old, so it's too late. I would have discovered it much earlier.
Yeah.
Um, but it could be a form of creative writing. I think writers,
Mhm.
before they produce a novel, they probably fantasize about it. They might
Mhm.
have immersive daydreaming.
Yeah.
It's not maladaptive because the aftermath is a novel.
Mhm. Yeah.
But if they only fantasize about fame and receiving the Pulitzer Prize for the book, but they never get to write it, then it's maladaptive.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's a great trait that can help people with problem solving, with rehearsing of all kind of skills. Uh, so I'm told it's a fantastical form of entertainment too. Uh, so all of that is good in moderation.
Moderation.
So I have a personal question, kind of going along with what you said. Um, so are you familiar with like the whole lucid dreaming aspect? Do you think that lucid dreaming is a form of maladaptive daydreaming? Or do you think that they're just completely two different things and can be two different mental?
No, you ask excellent question because we're not there yet. We don't know, but it's an excellent question because in lucid dreaming, people actually script their their nocturnal dreams, the nighttime dreams, and uh, they are aware that they are dreaming while they're dreaming, which is very much like immersive daydreaming, only they are asleep. But if they have consciousness while they are asleep, what kind of sleep is it? I don't know. So it's a great question. What's the relationship between the fantastic ability for lucid dreaming and maladaptive daydreaming? One is conducted at night, one during the day, but in both cases, the person appears to be aware of what they're doing.
Mhm.
Here's another dissertation for you.
Yeah. So along the lines before where you were talking about the modules and how they can't be accessed at the moment, what can be is something of self-diagnosis. So you developed the MDS-16, which is a 16 question assessment. Can you explain for the audience more in depth of what that is and what other diagnostic instruments there may have been developed?
The 16-item maladaptive daydreaming scale measures the main hallmarks, the main features, the unique features of this form of daydreaming. The vividness of it, the, the need to for music to accentuate the fantasy, the role of movement, the yearning for it. So, so but self-report scales are never the basis of a diagnosis.
Mhm.
This is good for research and for screening. We have a cutoff point, a research-based cutoff point.
Mhm.
So people who score above in English language cultures above 40, the scale spans from 0 to 100. So to score above 40, likely to have maladaptive daydreaming, but note my cautionary language because it's not a diagnosis.
Mm.
To form a diagnosis, you need a clinician
Yeah.
to interview the person.
Yeah.
And we have developed suggested diagnostic criteria. And based on those suggested diagnostic criteria, we developed a structured clinical interview.
Yeah.
So this kind of this is the gold standard for psychiatric diagnosis. You need to be interviewed by a clinician that needs to verify that the item that you've endorsed is indeed indicative of that specific symptom.
Okay.
Because people may over endorse.
Yeah.
So clinical interview, the clinician really insists on the interviewee providing example.
Yeah.
So these two combined can offer a fairly good diagnosis, but people can take the maladaptive daydreaming scale and sort of get a uh, rough guess, I guess, of whether or not they should perhaps seek a more in-depth assessment. We're now also developing scales for children,
Mhm.
which is more difficult, because young children cannot really answer questionnaires with complex language. So
Yeah.
with children, it's more difficult. Older children, like young adolescents may be able to complete self-reports, but with children, you need checklists to be filled out by parents or teachers.
Mm.
These checklists, of course, refer to observable behaviors, not to the internal
Mhm. Mm.
processes of the mind.
Mhm.
So that's the next challenge. It's a gap that we currently have in knowledge. How does this manifest and how can it be measured?
So I have a question. Lena, we were talking about how there's a scale and there was like a test. You can see like how far along in that scale that you are. Do you think that everyone has some sort is on that scale of maladaptive daydreaming? It just may not be as bad because like, for example, someone can
Like there's a
have,
spectrum.
right, like someone can have like OCD or they cannot have OCD, but there's also like a middle. Do you think that is the same with maladaptive daydreaming?
Yes, I think that you are quite accurate in actually identify the current trends in mental health. We are not talking anymore about categorical kind of classifications. So either you're pregnant or you're not pregnant. There's no scale there. So in many cases, in many diseases, for example, it's either you're positive or negative for it. In mental health is different because, for example, we are all sometimes apprehensive or stressed because of exams, because of demands in our life, but we are not pathologically anxious. We are just alert and tense, which is a good thing because we don't want to be too relaxed when you need to be at your best.
Right.
Mm.
Uh, or sometimes we are sad because we lost a good friendship, because we didn't get a grade as high as we expected. We're disappointed uh, because somebody offended us. And these are feelings that are within the boundaries of normality. So it's all a matter of degree. Normal, normal apprehension can become pathological anxiety, unrelenting, most of the hours of the day, every day.
Yeah.
Going back to your question, uh, yes, we all have we all have some we all experience the mental condition when our mind is off task and it wanders. And we sometimes try to imagine things that we daydream. Try to imagine how it would be when we desired partner date, what would we say, topics would we come up with, try to imagine different scenarios, what if he does that, how would it react if he did that. That's actually daydreaming. Uh, however, let me just qualify what I said because I also, if you remember, I also argued that we're talking about a trait. So a trait is either you have it or you don't.
Right.
So immersive daydreaming it exists on a continuum. So people can vary, I guess, to what degree can they fantasize and get a sense of presence in the fantasy. And people vary in how much time, not only in how real the fantasy is, but also how much time they invest in being there in the day. So the idea of mental phenomena existing on a continuum is the correct way of thinking in mental health, rather than the categorical option, the older categorical option. But I would say that Either you have the capacity for immersive daydreaming or you don't. But if you have it, that trait can vary.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in our old episode, or the one right before this, where we were talking about maladaptive daydreaming, there was a sense of confusion between maladaptive daydreaming and dissociative identity disorder, and you actually go into the difference in one of your papers. So you had a question about that.
Right. So, what do you think is could you go into more about what is the difference between dissociative identity disorder and then maladaptive daydreaming? And yeah, just kind of explain the difference.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. In maladaptive daydreaming, the protagonist that an individual envisions, creates, uh, feel under the control of the individual and feel separate from the individual, uh, and they never take control over the body. In dissociative identity disorder, the identity itself, including the memory and the talking style and sometimes the gender, the identity itself is separated. That has, of course, a traumatic origin. Uh, it's when a child starts to imagine that the trauma doesn't happen to them, but to somebody else, in order to feel protected from the pain. So that in order to continue to function, another identity takes over some of the intolerable feelings, so that so the main identity that has to deal with the external world will be bothered and weighed down by the traumatic memory. In maladaptive daydreaming, we don't need to have catastrophic trauma that creates these uh, splinters of the identity. Usually, the person has a unified sense of who they are,
Mhm.
but they have uh, imaginary protagonists that, of course, are a product of their own mind, who interact, and they usually observe them. Sometimes people can fantasize that they are in their daydream, but these protagonists never take control over the body. In dissociative identity disorder, sometimes there is a switch. The identity changes and person loses control, doesn't remember what happened with another personality, with another took over. So one is clearly post-traumatic. It involves loss of control, loss of memory,
Mm.
switches occur, and uh, and the protagonist taking the identity is taking control over the body. In maladaptive daydream, we're talking just excessive immersion in fantasy life that is completely under control. The individual, although sometimes, of course, when it becomes excessive and addictive, subjectively there is a sense of I can't control it, but eventually they can. They can. It's a decision to report on some. So these are related but distinct and different disorders. The DID is unfortunately much more severe because it is always a result of incredibly harsh childhood trauma, prolonged childhood trauma.
Okay. So it's not necessarily a trait for DID. And then there's also that dissociation with reality versus dissociation with your own personality. So there's a lot of different causes and effects between the two.
Right, right. But it's also a good question. Not all children who undergo trauma develop DID. So there could be probably an underlying propensity for dissociation,
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
the ability to imagine that it's not happening to me, it's happening to her.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, that about wraps it up with all of our questions. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer all of them.
I was really impressed by the depth of your questions. Some of them really touched upon the cutting edge of science and the things that are really waiting for us to investigate it. These are the occasions when I told you I challenge you to conduct research in this because you're the future generation researchers.
Well, thank you for building that foundation.
Yeah, we're super interested about this entire topic and we wanted to know more about it, but thank you so much for answering all our questions.
Yeah, and thank you for educating our audience because I'm sure none of them know what maladaptive daydreaming was or and now is. And you just reached a whole broader audience. So thank you for that.
You're most welcome. Send me the link so I could watch it.
We
Of course.
will. Thank you.
Thank you. So that was a great episode with Dr. Eli Somer. Do you guys have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, it's really incredible how much we have discovered on maladaptive daydreaming, but also how much we have yet to discover through the lining of our questions. A lot of his response, not a lot, but here and there, it's like, okay, we haven't done research on that part yet. So
Right.
it's still very young, and this is a great opportunity to enhance the general population's understanding on what this is and what it can become.
Yeah, I think we all learned so much about maladaptive daydreaming from the actual like creator and founder. And I feel like we got to talk to you guys, and I feel like you guys will learn a lot more from this as well.
I think in our last episode with just the three of us, we had a couple lingering questions that we couldn't answer because we didn't really have that much knowledge on the topic. So it was kind of cool to ask and get an
Someone
answer.
that
So,
actually coined the term.
exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Thank you guys so much for watching this episode, and we'll see you next week for episode 6.
Bye, guys.